Hi, everybody. I'm Matt. I am a PhD candidate with the School of Public and International Affairs, and I am also the Civil and Political Rights Measurement Lead for the Human Rights Measurement Initiative, and I will let Morgan introduce herself with the presentation.
Hi, everyone. So I am Morgan. I'm also a fourth year PhD candidate in SPIA, and this is our paper, Optionless, International Migration and Human Trafficking. So I'm going to overview kind of the introduction and motivation to our paper, and then get into the theory of why we connect migration and trafficking. So this is kind of an overview here. So getting started, we know that through previous research and the establishment of the Palermo Protocol, that human trafficking and forced labor are a lot of times intertwined and even mistaken for one another. So with the establishment of the Palermo Protocol, we were given a common definition of what exactly trafficking in persons meant in 2000. So I'm not going to belabor everyone with this really long definition, but this is kind of where we start with our baseline of what do we mean by human trafficking. So there are a lot of existing theories as to why human trafficking occurs. These can be the push and pull factors that motivate traffickers and kind of seduce individuals into the trade. Cho in 2012 talks about globalization being the root cause because there's more movement in persons and freedom of borders and shifting of people around, that this is one of the main causes of human trafficking. And in that paper, he further deliberates what he calls the 4 pillars of human trafficking. And others kind of pose migration more as this indirect source of human trafficking because of the foreign exposure and contact. But in our theory, we really want to focus on migration as a direct cause of human trafficking. And why? Why do we think this? Well, because of vulnerability. We believe that migrants, and oftentimes those that are escaping situations of conflict or are victims of forced migration, this creates extreme vulnerability, not only physically, but mentally, emotionally, and all the other circumstances around them economically as well, that this can create ripe opportunity for what we call smuggling gone wrong. So this particularly targets women and children who are very vulnerable during situations of migration, and what could start as like this is a human smuggling operation, we're trying to get you across a border, is then manipulated into a trafficking situation. So in our paper, we're less interested in trafficker behavior. While that is important, we're really looking at these wider environmental or, as one might say, structural components as to why trafficking occurs. So why do we believe this is happening? Well, we believe that rational actors, being the traffickers, capitalize on this vulnerability, and that it's highest among migrants, which creates them into being the ideal trafficking victim. Because people are viewed as a renewable product in their mind, the logic of supply and demand kicks in. Consumerism also plays a part into this, as well as large organizations that demand cheap labor. So finally, unlike studies that focus on aggregate counts of trafficking victims, we're really interested in the role of the supply chain. And, I hate to say it, but, the supply chain, a big focus right now, and it's even so much so for us as well. So we're really interested here on the source and destination countries, and we're using the existing categorizations in the Trafficking in Persons report as our measure of prevalence and levels of human trafficking. And Matt's going to discuss that further now.
Yes, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our variables, what we end up running and what we end up finding. So in terms of our dependent variable for this paper, we end up using source and destination assignments in these Trafficking in Persons reports. All of this was put together by the Human Trafficking Indicators data set. I believe that's going to be Richard Frank, who's Australia National University, I want to say right now. But as part of his dissertation project, he put together a wide range of variables built from these Trafficking in Persons reports. State Department puts them out every year, and it includes a wealth of information on trends in trafficking, country by country across the globe. There's positives and negatives to that, which I can talk about a little bit later during the question and answer period. For our independent variable, we also think about vulnerability a little bit different in terms of the push and pull of economic migration versus conflict migration, thinking more traditionally about refugees as like another group of people who are particularly vulnerable, and splitting these apart a little bit and examining whether their role in the supply versus demand, destination, source, global supply chain of human trafficking differs. I am not going to get into this now. If you want more information, I can go into it later, but we build a monadic economic gravity measure. We're thinking about GDP, GDP growth, and GDP per capita. The bottom line with this is that we expect countries that have a highly positive gravity, a lot of inbound, more highly developed types of places are going to be associated with destination. They're going to be identified as a destination of human trafficking more. And if you have a highly negative gravity, thinking about you being a source of human trafficking. And we might also think about it the same way with refugee figures, right? We end up running 6 models, logistic regression from 2000 to 2011. Again, I'm not going to go super in depth with this, but we end up finding pretty much on par with expectations. Okay, yep, 6 minutes is up, but we're going to roll through this real quick. Yeah, for source, we end up finding basically what we expected, GDP and GDP per capita. The more negative your economic gravity is, the more you're associated with being a source of human trafficking. Growth gravity is a little bit different. You might take that more as the more unstable economies are more associated with being a source of human trafficking. And we find the opposite, the exact opposite for destination, right? The more positive your economic gravity is, the more you're identified as a destination of human trafficking. And so Morgan, I will pass it over to you for the discussion.
Great. So we just have a few questions here that we wanted to use to help spur discussions. So I guess our first question that we wanted to pose to the group was, does using big data like this, big aggregate global reports, get us the whole picture? Is it possible to make generalizations about large human trafficking or trends at a global scale?
You can also, if you have questions about anything with it or want to comment on either of these other questions, feel free to. Oh, we have a question in chat, it looks like. I can't see that.
It just says ecological inference, ?
Could you, whoever asked that question, could you type a little bit more in chat about that, just to explain sort of what you mean? Other questions?
The follow-up to that, Matt, was just wondering how we account for this.
How we account for ecological inference. Individual inference form aggregate data. I'm not really sure I'm grasping the content of sort of what your question is, but I'm happy, like, after this presentation, if you want to, narratives can help. Yes, 100%. Part of the issue with doing something like this is that you lose out very heavily on the individual level. And part of that is by necessity, right? Because when we're talking about source and destinations of human trafficking, we are necessarily talking about the aggregate, right? We're speaking about entire countries, entire states, and how they factor into the supply chain. When it comes to, looking at individual narratives and things like that, it absolutely helps. And hopefully that's going to be a part of more broader examinations of this concept of vulnerability. Researchers who are much better at the qualitative stuff than, I will ever be, coming in and being able to build narratives based off of that. But absolutely.
And then we have another question in the chat. Was it easy to divide countries into sending and receiving?
So yes, because we didn't have to do anything. The human trafficking indicators already does this for us. It's really a fantastic little data set. There's issues with it that I'll get into in a second, but it's fantastic in the sense that it's built aggregating all of these different variables across the trafficking in persons reports. And so, right at the get-go, we have these identifications of X country was a source of human trafficking, it was a destination for human trafficking, and it was transit. And that's regularized across all countries, right? And so I think literally that variable is just built in terms of reading those first three sentences and an identification of, does it mention source? Does it mention destination? Does it mention transit? And so we felt pretty comfortable in ending up using that. It comes with problems, though. The part of the reason that we are using these binary identifiers is because there's a latent measure. There's like a latent amount of bias in these trafficking in persons reports. I'm thinking about a recent paper by I can't remember the co-authors, but Rachel Harmon over at Emory's political science department. I think she just graduated, and she does so much excellent work in human trafficking, but identifying that states that have important economic or otherwise deals with the US sort of get off easier in the trafficking in persons report, and they're not held to as big of an account, and the reports aren't as critical. And so yeah, it's just sort of built from those first three sentences, because I think that's kind of all we're comfortable using and saying with it. Anything more than that, and you get into like weird bias territory, and I don't know how much I would trust it, especially in this 11-year span.
Alyssa, thank you for your questions as well. Asking if we considered other sources besides the tip reports, potentially glow tip from UNODC. I haven't personally looked into this report as much. I'm much more familiar with the State Department's report, and even though there is a lot of bias, the coverage and the amount of time that it allows us to look at is really helpful. Matt, I don't know if you had any other thoughts on this one.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely something to look into. The primary cost with any sort of research dealing with corpus documents like this, the primary cost is time. And that's a big reason why we chose the Franks data, because it is there and we do not have to go through and code anything. But my hope is that, and it's such a big problem too, where we really need to have researchers that are heavily focused on a variety of measurement procedures, which is why something like this is fantastic. It's difficult to get money to go through corpus documents like that and code them for every single year and produce data that researchers can use. But it is something that needs to happen. And if there are any enterprising, young PhD students, spry and looking for something to do, a data set to create, that may be an excellent idea right now. Which report is Frank's data? That's going to be the is it the Human Trafficking Index or Indicators, Morgan?
It's right here. I'll link it in the chat really quick.
Okay, great.
I guess this also sort of interacts with our second question, kind of about how we can improve measuring our dependent variable and how this interacts with current concerns, just kind of regarding measuring prevalence. I don't know if anyone has any other thoughts there. Oh, and then we have another question here about correlation versus causation.
Okay, I see that now. Migration and trafficking, are you arguing correlation or causation? I think for this version of the paper, with how, just sort of with how nascent everything is, we're more so thinking correlation rather than causation. A causal argument is obviously like the gold standard here, but I'm not comfortable. There's so much in terms of human trafficking that is not covered by just looking at the ways that different states interact with one another. You think about the entire swath of things dealing with, internal like migration patterns and trafficking, in terms of, once, how does that relate to levels of trafficking that are happening like within countries rather than between and whatever else. And I am of the mindset that there's not necessarily anything wrong with that either, that you're going in and saying, look at these things that are associated together. We think it's because of this. There needs to be more work like tying these things together. So yeah.
I guess I have a question about that sort of relates to your third question. And I guess my question is, what does this research feed into? What do you see it serving in the bigger picture? Because you sort of talk there about policy implications and the relationship of the implications of that relationship, that you might be seeing a correlate relationship between these two flows. So I just wondered what is the agenda behind the research, and not maybe your agenda, but where you see that feeding into the international development sector?
Morgan, I'm going to let you answer that one.
No, that's a great question. Yeah, I think that this helps us kind of think more broadly outside of some of the like popularized and maybe even in some cases just narratives around trafficking that have been created over time. Lots of times, like overemphasizing certain forms of trafficking over one another, kind of the ways that it's been talked about in the media or in film and things like that. And so using this paper to speak to kind of the broader scope of, the average trafficking victim is more often someone that is, under the situation of forced migration than someone who is maybe forcibly kidnapped, something like that. Not to say that those aren't trafficking victims as well. I just think that there's a lot of misunderstanding around who the right trafficking, like who actually are trafficking victims, number one. Number two, like how do we measure this? How do we talk about it? And then also, what does this mean for things like the Schengen Agreement that allows for free movement of persons? Yes, while that's a good thing, on the one hand, what are some of these unintended effects of when we do allow for lots of free movement? What kind of results does that have for individuals who are trafficked, could be trafficked? And then also, how do we deal with kind of the legal consequences of that as well? So under whose jurisdiction does it fall? Does it fall under the source country or where they were intended to go? So I think that there's just several different areas in which this research will feed into, as well as, I know this is kind of a more baseline perspective, but it just adds to the empirical research on this topic. There's not a lot of, there's continually more and more, especially as we're learning about today, which I'm so excited about. But Matt, I don't know if you have comments.
I'll finish on one quick thought and then we'll close this. But this is very much so a political science article. Political scientists are awful about not writing about something unless you have a theoretical framework to like put on top of it. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't get published in big journals or whatever. And so part of our hope with this article too is that by framing this concept of vulnerability, it's something that all of our lizard brain, like political science stuff can latch onto and sort of build a research agenda forward a little bit more and start to integrate disciplines in a way that's going to be fruitful. And with that, I will close this off. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.